I was driving for Costco a few years back. It was around this time of year. We usually took extra toy shipments to various locations due to the holiday season. We got a call that one of our locations in rural Kentucky needed to restock their giant Spider-Man dolls. They knew I was a fast driver, so I was giving the last-minute late-night duty. I loaded my truck and headed out on the 265. It was around 3 a.m. when I started to have this eerie feeling. I chalked it up to just being tired and popped a couple of NODOs. About 15 minutes later, the road started to fog up. I mean, more so than any other time before or since. It got to the point where I had to pull off to the side and wait. There wasn't any other cars on the road and I was ahead of time, so I figured I could wait until it cleared up a bit. About 5 minutes of sitting still in silence, my truck goes dead. No lights, no engine, nothing. I try my CB but cannot get anyone on. I check my cell phone and there is no signal. As I'm sitting there contemplating my next move, I hear what sounds like a child crying. It slowly morphed into a woman crying, or at least that's what it sounded like to me. Now I'm a big man, 6'3", 250 pounds, but I refused to exit my cab. I did roll down my window and asked if anybody needed help. At that point, the crying stopped. Then I heard what sounded like a sinister laugh. At that point, I felt like the laughter was directed at me. I rolled up my window, and it seemed like the more scared I became, the louder the laugh went. Then as soon as it started, it stopped. And just like that, my truck started back up and the fog dissipated. I drove out of there like a bat out of hell. I get to the next truck stop and pull in. I run to the bathroom and pour water on my face and ask myself, did that really just happen? I go out to the diner and see this fella in a John Deere hat, red flannel and blue jeans. I needed to know if anyone else experienced that too. I go up to him and say, "Excuse me, are you a fellow trucker? 'Cause I just had one hell of an experience." He says, "Not a trucker, but..." I can tell you a story, but alas, this is not a horror story, but our reality with you. In the late 80s and early 90s, my father worked as a trucker in East Africa, so he somehow drove along Rwanda. This was shortly before the genocide that happened there, and on one of the checkpoints, some armed people threw him out of the car. He probably looked like Tutsi, so he was thrown into a cage along with the same unfortunate. Father tried to explain that he was not a Rwandan at all, but no one understood his language. Every night, 5 prisoners were removed from the cage and dealt with them right in front of my father. On the 3rd night, he met a man who spoke a little on Swahili, and my father understood on him, and explained that he was not a Rwandan and showed his certificate. Somehow, his father managed to pray freedom for himself. He even returned a truck on which he left. Lord, how glad I am that your father survived, but at the thought of the rest, my heart is already doused with blood. I am ready to argue your father has a terrible mental trauma after these murders. I myself am not a long range, but my classmate from Miami told a story, and he swears that this is a pure truth. Somehow, late at night, he and his girlfriend went to Nipples through Everglades along a 2-lane road. They had to stand in a traffic jam, ahead of which was an 18-wheeled truck. In the end, the girl fell asleep, and he began to look for something worthy of his hearing on the radio. Only one radio station became worthy of something worthy. However, the DJ intervened, saying something like, "Tonight the stars in Everglades shine especially brightly, and if you are passing here, then slow down and look at the night sky." As my friend said, usually he wouldn't even think to pay attention to it, but that night he felt that he had to do what DJ said. Having woken up a friend, he convinced her, sleeping and dissatisfied with the rise, stop and look at the stars. They looked at the sky for 5 to 10 minutes. A friend says that it was the most beautiful sky that he had only seen. Returning to the road, they continued their way. On the way, they witnessed a terrible accident. The truck unfolded, and he crushed several cars that were behind him. He said that there were many victims, but I could not find any confirmation of this. History occurred in 2005 or so. According to him, if not for the DJ, they would also please the list of victims. Somewhere in 2006, I was driving on an onboard truck loaded with a bunch of building materials, drywall, roof. I don't remember exactly, but it was everything packed in boxes. I remember. I pulled them even by moors for fastening. The whole action took place somewhere in the countryside of Tennessee, between Nashville and Memphis, closer to the border of the states of Tennessee, Alabama, and Memphis. I needed to wrap everything with a tarp, so I tied the cargo, wrapped everything in them, and left the consignor. 5 miles further in the wilderness in the middle of the forest, I noticed that my tarp was fluttering in the wind. Somehow I attached it back, but for a long time it would not have lasted, so I decided to get out of the road and do everything as it should. Everything was already done. It remains only to wrap everything back into the tarp, when suddenly I noticed a guy on the same side of the road moving directly to my truck. At first, I just decided to look after him, for we were in the wilderness and you never know what could happen while continuing the work. As soon as it came to fixing the belts, this dude came to me close enough for me to pay more attention to him than to my work. I took my bar for a winch and put it on a trailer just in case. 8 pounds of metal 4 inches in length. A thing is needed to strengthen belts, screeds, etc. The guy came up to me, and the first thing that caught my eye was his hair. The hairstyle was in the style of mallet, but some kind of sloppy as the devil knows what. It was as if the guy wanted to cut his hair for himself, but he had some kind of seizure in the process, and as a result, he sent all the fuck and went like that. For the party is normal, yeah. His eyes were like a madman. They were not like a drunk or a drug addict, but it still created the impression that the roof of the guy flowed for a long time. The clothes were dirty and torn. I also remember that on one of his white boots there were no laces, and the tongue was clearly not where necessary. He stopped in front of me and said, "I had a long walk." Well, I am like this, they say. Yeah, of course. You, his mother, in the wilderness. I transparently hinted at him that, they say, there was nothing to hang around here. He nods, goes further, and then turns around near the driver's door, returns, and again. I had a long walk. This time I explained to him that I wouldn't drive him. I have insurance, all things, etc. Apologized. He seemed to understand and left. After waiting for him to go far enough, I continued work, with one eye, however, looking at the guy. When I finished, I again turned in his direction to check where he was. He was 100 yards from me and moved again to me. Everything looked as if he was talking on the phone. He put his hand to his face. I jumped into the truck, putting a bar for a hole in the passenger seat just in case. When I looked at the guy again, I realized that he was chatting not on the phone, but with his own fucking hand. Moreover, the dialogue was by no means friendly, but clearly as some kind of aggressive. In general, I started a truck and rushed immediately, even despite the road. When I drove past him, he gave me his fucked look. He still held his hand by his face. However, when I moved and looked in the rearview mirror, there was not a soul behind. Still goosebumps from him on the skin as I remember. My dad drove a truck between London and Edinburgh. He often told me the story that happened to him there. When he rode along the road and looked to the right, he saw a woman. His father compared her to Miss Trambull from the film Matilda, who looked at him from the car with an expression of extreme horror. Before he could react, this car rushed away. About half an hour later, another car appeared, but her passenger was the same woman with the same expression of horror on her face. The father then thought, they say, well, his fuck, and drove into the nearest car service. Even if it was a trifle, but it's better to play it safe, right? He did not consider the numbers, nothing at all, so there was no sense in contacting the police. However, after 4 hours, when my father was already in London, the other car caught up with him, and the same woman was visible through the window with the same expression on her face, but with the only difference that now she seemed to shout something to him. Then his father could not stand it and turned to the police. As it turned out, the police have already received 3 messages about this woman in the last few minutes. Unfortunately, although his father followed the news in the hope of finding out something about her, but he did not see or hear anything about her anymore. Maybe these meetings were only a coincidence. This story reminded me of a case from my childhood. I was then a senior schoolboy in the yard summer and part-time Dad's birthday. Then we went to the casino, located 2 hours from us, in order to see how my uncle will participate in a boxing match. As it ended, we immediately went home. We were approaching the canyon near which I did not get in touch, so before that we called my mother and said that we would soon be at home. About 30 minutes later, there was about midnight. When we arrived at the canyon, we were already tired, but in order to maintain a conversation, we began to tell each other stories, horror stories mainly. It seemed that time flowed quite slowly. As soon as we crossed a steep hill, I immediately had a feeling of déjà vu, as if we had already crossed it. We have been here 100 times and lay out every corner, so everyone was aware of what and where it is located here. However, we continued to chat, having gone through this hill again. This time I pointed to everyone to this fact. Father and uncle immediately looked at the time. It was 1 in the morning, and we were not at home yet. We were a little scared. Then we stopped chatting and began to just go. Now, thinking, we noticed that time seemed to be driven under us. We left the canyon at about 1:15 and immediately called the mother, who was already excited to the limit due to our absence. Until now, we have no idea where the extra 45 minutes or so. When I rode the abandoned part of the state of Baltimore, my radio suddenly turned on by itself. At first there was only a sound of interference, but then suddenly a voice came with a deep South accent. I have no panties on me. On that road between the borders of the states, no one except me rode. Honestly, I don't remember specifically when and why it began, but I hear about this phenomenon of 26 years already. Like, you leave the radio on, and then once you hear this, at least this happens once a day. A voice is always with a southern accent, and even in a whisper always speaks. People, I climbed into Google here, and this is what I found. Presumably, there was one old dude in Oklahoma City who constantly scrolled his "no panties on me" on the 19th channel. He had some kind of reinforced radio transmitter, which he owned illegally. Later, he also issued something in that spirit. In general, he became famous among truckers and amateur radio. Under prosperous atmospheric conditions, his signals heard half the country. His name was Klaus Kramer, and he was at least twice covered by the Federal Commission for Communications and fined him for $10,000. All this was somewhere in 2001. All the documents are in the public domain. It is edited. It is worth adding that even though Kramer has already understood, but it lives, the joke has become popular among bored drivers or just loafers who do not feed bread. Let someone rang. Somehow I was driving the east of Washington. On those roads, I didn't come across either stops or the city, but I had already sneaked a decent in the area, so I knew that about every 40 miles there were soil platforms, which you can move out of the road and calmly park. So I, in fact, decided to dwell on one of these and sleep. I covered the curtains and lay down to see something on the phone. About an hour later, I heard someone trying to open the door from the driver's side. I must say, all the time I did not hear someone to drive along the road, but there was nothing to do, and I was about to get up to look from under the curtains at the knocking, but as soon as I started peering into the night darkness from the window, as I immediately heard that they are now trying to open the door from the passenger. I tried to look from above through the curtains, but I never saw anything in the pitch darkness. Then I started a truck and turned on the light. I was so scared then that even in the light I did not completely open the curtains, but looked only into the gaps. However, there was no one nearby, so I only took a deep breath and pulling the curtains lay back. But as soon as I calmed down and convinced myself that all this happened because of the wind, and then it was rather windy, the sound came right there, as if someone was trying to open the ventilation hole. The pins on the doors twitched, and the truck went with a shaking, as if someone was trying to climb on him. I pressed the signal to somehow scare the uninvited guests, but this only caused even more noise. In addition, there was a knock of fingers on the window and frame, and from the side of the suspension a whistle of air was heard. And then everything suddenly stopped. A couple of moments I heard only my intermittent breathing and a beat of the heart, but then I heard a truck passing by me. I waited a few more hours, but it did not appear anymore. In the morning I could not find visible damage at the truck or traces of the legs around, but on each window traces of small hands were visible as if a small child left them.